The envelope looked older than some of the houses on his street. Its corners were worn soft with age. The stamp had faded almost beyond recognition. Across the front, in careful blue handwriting, was the name Thomas Walker, followed by the address where he had lived for nearly 50 years outside Asheville, North Carolina. The postmark, however, made no sense. The 17th of October, 1983. 78-year-old Thomas Walker stood silently on his front porch staring at the envelope, while the mail carrier apologized for the third time. Mr. Walker, the regional distribution center, found it sealed inside a damaged mailbag during renovations. Somehow it was never processed. Thomas barely heard the explanation. His eyes were fixed on the return address. There wasn't one, only a familiar military unit designation, written in the upper left corner, 2nd Ranger Battalion. His hands began to tremble. Every man from that patrol had either come home or never would. Slowly, he opened the brittle envelope. Inside rested a single folded sheet of Army stationery. The handwriting stopped him cold. It belonged to Sergeant Daniel Hayes, the closest friend Thomas had ever had. Official records stated Daniel had been killed during a classified border reconnaissance mission more than 40 years earlier. Thomas had attended the memorial service himself. Yet somehow this letter had been written 3 days after the mission. He unfolded the page with shaking hands. There were only 4 sentences. Tom, if this letter reaches you, then I finally found what we were looking for. They told everyone I didn't make it back. But don't believe everything they tell you. If you're reading this, come to Black Pine Station. Before the first snowfall, I've waited long enough. Thomas read the words again and again. Then he quietly looked toward the framed military photograph hanging above his fireplace. 2 young Rangers smiled back at him from another lifetime. One of them had supposedly died 43 years ago. Within 24 hours, Thomas would leave the quiet life he had built behind, drive hundreds of miles into the Appalachian Mountains, uncover the truth behind one of the Army's most forgotten Cold War operations, and discover that the man he had mourned for more than 4 decades might never have stopped waiting for him at all. Thomas Walker sat alone in his living room long after the sun disappeared behind the Blue Ridge Mountains. The old letter remained open on the coffee table beside a pair of reading glasses he no longer remembered taking off. At 78 years old, Thomas had lived a quiet life outside Asheville, North Carolina. Every morning began with black coffee on the porch. Every afternoon ended with a slow walk through the small apple orchard behind his farmhouse. Since his wife Eleanor passed away 5 years earlier, very little ever changed. Until now, he picked up the letter once more and carefully studied Daniel Hayes' handwriting. Every curve of every letter was unmistakable. During their years together in the 2nd Ranger Battalion, Daniel had written dozens of notes exactly like this. Thomas knew the handwriting better than his own. Yet according to every official military record, Daniel had died on a classified reconnaissance mission in October 1983. Thomas himself had folded the American flag presented to Daniel's parents during the memorial service. He remembered standing beside the empty casket because Daniel's body had supposedly never been recovered. 43 years later, the words on the page made everything he believed suddenly feel uncertain. Don't believe everything they tell you. Thomas quietly walked toward the fireplace. Hanging above it was an old photograph taken during training at Fort Benning. 2 young Rangers stood shoulder to shoulder with muddy uniforms, broad smiles, and the confidence that only 25-year-old soldiers seem able to carry. Daniel had written across the bottom of the photograph years earlier, "Brothers until the last patrol." Thomas gently touched the faded ink with one finger. "What did you mean?" he whispered. Sleep never came that night. Before sunrise, Thomas unlocked an old cedar chest stored in his attic. Inside rested the few military belongings he had kept after retirement. His dress uniform, a stack of faded photographs, his Ranger Barrett, an old road atlas, and a weathered topographic map of western North Carolina, marked with dozens of handwritten notes from long-forgotten training exercises. Folded inside the map was another surprise, a black-and-white photograph of an abandoned communications outpost. Across the back, Daniel had written only 2 words, "Black Pine." Thomas stared at the image. The name immediately matched the final sentence of the mysterious letter. "Come to Black Pine Station before the first snowfall." A memory surfaced from somewhere deep inside his mind. Black Pine Station had never appeared on official maps. During the early years of the Cold War, it served as a remote Army listening post, hidden high in the Appalachian Mountains. Very few soldiers even knew it existed. Thomas remembered visiting it only once during specialized communications training. It had already been scheduled for closure. No one had spoken about it again after 1983. By mid-morning, Thomas loaded his old pickup truck with camping gear, warm clothing, food, and the military map. Before leaving, he drove to the local veterans center, hoping someone else might remember Black Pine Station. Most of the older veterans shook their heads. Then 90-year-old retired radio operator Frank Sullivan quietly spoke from the corner of the room. Black Pine? Thomas turned immediately. Frank slowly nodded. I haven't heard that name in 40 years. Thomas handed him Daniel's letter. Frank adjusted his glasses and carefully read every word. His expression gradually became serious. Daniel Hayes, he whispered. Good man. Thomas leaned forward. You knew him? Frank nodded again. Only briefly. Then he looked directly into Thomas's eyes. You need to understand something. What? Frank hesitated for several seconds before answering. The report they gave your unit wasn't the report we transmitted. Silence filled the room. Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. What are you saying? Frank lowered his voice. The last radio message we received from Black Pine never confirmed Daniel's death. Thomas stared without speaking. Frank continued. It only said one ranger was missing after the operation. Thomas felt the floor beneath him suddenly seem less solid. Then why did they declare him dead? Frank slowly shook his head. Because 43 years ago, somebody changed the report before it reached headquarters. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Thomas folded the letter and slipped it carefully back into his jacket pocket. Then I'm going to Black Pine. Frank looked toward the mountains visible through the Veterans Center window. If you find what's waiting up there, he paused before finishing the sentence. It'll change everything you thought you knew about your best friend. Thomas quietly nodded, climbed back into his truck, and began the long drive toward the Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of miles away, hidden beneath decades of abandoned forest. Black Pine Station waited exactly where Daniel had written it, and if the letter was telling the truth, someone had been waiting there even longer. Thomas Walker drove through the Appalachian Mountains until the paved highways gave way to narrow gravel roads winding beneath towering pines. Autumn had already painted the hillsides in deep shades of gold and crimson. The higher he climbed, the colder the air became. Every mile brought back memories he had spent 4 decades trying to forget. Shortly before sunset, he reached the final location marked on the faded military map. The road ended at a rusted steel gate, hanging crooked on broken hinges. Beyond it, nature had nearly erased every trace of Black Pine Station. Weeds covered the cracked pavement. Moss climbed abandoned concrete buildings. A weathered radio tower leaned against the mountainside like an old soldier refusing to fall. Thomas stepped out of his truck and stood silently. You really existed, he whispered. According to official Army records, Black Pine Station had been dismantled in 1984. Looking around, it was obvious nobody had touched the place for decades. Yet something immediately caught his attention. Fresh tire tracks crossed the muddy entrance road. Someone had driven through the gate within the past few days. Thomas followed the tracks cautiously until reaching the main operations building. The front door hung open. Dust covered nearly everything inside, except a narrow path leading toward the basement. Someone had been here recently. He switched on his flashlight and slowly descended the concrete stairs. The air smelled of damp earth and rusted machinery. At the end of the hallway stood the old communications room. Most of the equipment had been stripped away years earlier, but one metal filing cabinet remained locked against the far wall. Resting on top of it was a small object covered with dust. Thomas froze. It was an old army compass. He immediately recognized the scratches carved into the brass casing. 44 years earlier, he had given that compass to Daniel as a birthday gift before their deployment. No one else could possibly own it. His pulse quickened. Daniel? Only silence answered. Thomas carefully picked up the compass. Folded beneath it was a fresh sheet of paper. The ink looked no more than a few days old. I knew you'd come eventually. You're late. But I never stopped believing. Thomas felt every hair on the back of his neck stand up. He looked around the empty room. Who's here? No answer came. Only the distant sound of wind moving through broken windows. The note continued. If you're reading this, then someone finally delivered my letter. Open the cabinet. Everything starts there. Thomas examined the old lock. To his surprise, it wasn't secured anymore. The door opened with a single pull. Inside rested dozens of military files tied together with faded string, several reel-to-reel radio recordings, an old field journal, and one sealed envelope addressed in Daniel's handwriting, "For Tom only." Thomas sat down in the dusty chair beside the cabinet before opening the journal first. The earliest entries described the final reconnaissance mission exactly as he remembered it, but halfway through, the story changed completely. Daniel wrote that their patrol had discovered an unauthorized intelligence operation being conducted without the knowledge of their commanding officers. Sensitive surveillance equipment had been installed at Black Pine to monitor communications far beyond the mission officially assigned to the Rangers. The final pages became increasingly urgent. Daniel believed someone inside the military had falsified reports to hide the operation after it went wrong. He also wrote that he had gathered proof before disappearing. Thomas turned another page. A folded map slipped onto the floor. One location had been circled repeatedly in red pencil. Beside it, Daniel had written only 6 words, where they buried the real evidence. Before Thomas could study the map further, a vehicle engine echoed outside the abandoned station. Headlights swept across the broken windows. Someone else had just arrived at Black Pine. Then a man's voice called from outside. "Mr. Walker?" Thomas slowly stood, instinctively slipping Daniel's journal into his backpack. "Who's asking?" The voice answered immediately. "My name is James Hayes." Thomas's heart nearly stopped. "I'm Daniel's son." Thomas Walker hurried outside the abandoned communications building, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. A pickup truck sat near the broken gate, with its headlights still shining across the overgrown road. Standing beside it was a man in his early 40s wearing a worn canvas jacket and carrying an old military backpack. His face looked strangely familiar, not because Thomas had ever met him before, but because the man's eyes were unmistakably Daniel Hayes's. "You said your name is James?" Thomas asked quietly. The man nodded. "James Hayes." Thomas stared for several seconds. Daniel never had children. James lowered his eyes. That's what everyone believed. He reached into his backpack and carefully removed a faded family photograph. It showed a young woman holding a newborn baby. Standing beside her was Daniel Hayes wearing civilian clothes. The photograph had been taken only weeks before the final Black Pine mission. Thomas felt his breath catch. "Who is she?" "My mother," James answered. "Emily Hayes." Thomas slowly shook his head. "Daniel never told me." He didn't know. James explained that his parents had met only a few months before Daniel's final deployment. Emily discovered she was pregnant after the army informed her Daniel had been killed. Overwhelmed by grief and afraid of disrupting Daniel's family's mourning, she raised James alone without ever contacting the Hayes family. Before she died 2 years earlier, she finally gave James a small wooden box she had hidden for decades. Inside rested Daniel's photograph, several letters, and one unfinished journal page mentioning Black Pine Station. "Mom always believed Dad wasn't dead," James said softly. Everyone told her she was refusing to accept reality. Thomas slowly reached into his jacket and handed James the 43-year-old letter. James read it silently. Tears immediately filled his eyes. So she was right. They returned together to the communications room, where Thomas showed James the military journal and the map Daniel had hidden inside the filing cabinet. James carefully traced the red circle marked on the map. "This place is only a mile from here." The location pointed toward an abandoned fire lookout overlooking a steep valley. Daniel had written one final sentence beside the marking. "If I can't carry the truth out, I'll leave it where only Tom would think to look." Thomas smiled sadly. "He always knew how I thought." The two men packed the files and hiked toward the lookout under a sky filled with stars. Along the way, James quietly asked the question that had haunted him his entire life. "What was my father really like?" Thomas smiled without hesitation. "Stubborn." James laughed softly. "Mom used that word too. He never walked away from people who needed him." Thomas paused before continuing, "And he always believed promises mattered." They reached the old lookout tower shortly after midnight. The structure had partially collapsed years earlier, but the stone foundation remained intact. Thomas studied Daniel's map again before kneeling beside one corner of the foundation. "Help me move these rocks." After nearly 20 minutes of digging beneath loose stones, James's shovel struck metal. Together, they uncovered a weatherproof military storage case buried beneath the tower. The army seal across the lid remained clearly visible despite decades underground. Thomas carefully opened the case. Inside rested dozens of classified documents, undeveloped film canisters, cassette recordings, and one final sealed envelope. Across the front, Daniel had written, "For my family." James quietly picked up the envelope with trembling hands. Before he could open it, headlights suddenly illuminated the trees below the lookout. Another vehicle was climbing the old service road. Thomas quickly switched off his flashlight. Two black SUVs slowly stopped near the base of the hill. Several men stepped out carrying powerful flashlights. One of them called toward the tower, "Mr. Walker, Mr. Hayes, please don't leave. We need to talk." James looked at Thomas. "How do they know we're here?" Thomas glanced at the military case between them. "Because somebody else has been looking for this for 43 years. Thomas Walker and James Hayes quietly crouched behind the crumbling stone wall of the old fire lookout as flashlights swept across the hillside below. The two black SUVs remained parked near the base of the trail, while several men slowly climbed toward the tower. Thomas carefully pulled the weatherproof military case closer. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "this doesn't leave our hands." James nodded. Before either man could move, one of the voices called again, "Mr. Walker, we're not here to arrest you." Thomas answered from behind the wall. "Then why are you here?" The man stopped climbing and raised both hands where they could be seen. "My name is Colonel Richard Evans, United States Army Records Review Board." Thomas remained silent. The colonel continued, "We've been trying to find Black Pine's missing evidence for nearly 20 years. James frowned. "Then why follow us?" "Because your father's letter was entered into the military archive last week." Thomas immediately understood. The 43-year-old letter had triggered a review when it was finally delivered through the postal system. Army investigators realized Daniel's name had resurfaced after decades of silence. Slowly, Thomas stepped into the open. While keeping one hand on the military case, Colonel Evans removed his hat respectfully. "Mr. Walker, Sergeant Hayes deserves to have his name cleared." Thomas looked directly at him. "Then tell me why he was declared dead." The colonel lowered his eyes for several moments before answering. "Because someone inside Army intelligence altered the final report." Silence filled the mountain air. Evans explained that during the early 1980s, Black Pine Station had secretly become part of an unauthorized Cold War surveillance program. Daniel accidentally discovered evidence showing that illegal domestic communications had been intercepted without proper authorization. When the operation was exposed, senior officials feared a political scandal. Daniel gathered copies of the original records, intending to report them through official channels. Before he could return, he disappeared. Rather than admitting classified materials had been compromised, certain officials rewrote the mission report, declared Daniel killed in action, and sealed every file connected to Black Pine. Thomas clenched his fists. "You let his parents bury an empty coffin." Evans nodded slowly. "Yes. You let his son grow up, believing his father abandoned him." Evans could not answer. James quietly opened the envelope marked, "For my family." Inside rested a handwritten letter and an ultrasound photograph dated only weeks before Daniel's final mission. Tears filled James's eyes before he even finished the first paragraph. "To the child I may never meet. I don't know whether you're a son or a daughter. I only know that if you're reading this someday, then I loved you long before I ever held you. If I fail to come home, never believe that I chose duty over my family. I was trying to make sure the country you grow up in deserves people willing to tell the truth, even when it costs everything." James could no longer continue reading aloud. Thomas gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Colonel Evans quietly removed another folder from his briefcase. "There's something else you should see." It contained recently declassified satellite photographs reviewed only months earlier using modern imaging technology. The images revealed something search teams in 1983 could never have seen. A narrow rock slide had opened a hidden cave less than 2 miles beyond the lookout tower. Investigators believed it matched the final coordinates transmitted from Daniel's emergency beacon before all contact was lost. Evans looked toward the mountains. "We believe Sergeant Hayes never died at Black Pine Station." Thomas felt his heartbeat quicken. "Then where?" Evans pointed toward the cave marked on the satellite image. "We think he spent his final hours there protecting the evidence until rescue teams stopped searching." At sunrise the following morning, Thomas, James, Colonel Evans, and a military recovery team hiked toward the newly discovered cave. The entrance had remained completely hidden beneath rock and forest for more than 4 decades. Inside, they found Daniel Hayes exactly where history had forgotten him. His remains rested peacefully against the cave wall beside an old emergency radio, an unopened first aid kit, and the final pages of his field journal. The radio battery had died decades earlier. Rescue had never heard his last calls. Thomas slowly knelt beside his best friend. "I'm sorry it took me 43 years," he whispered. Resting in Daniel's hands was one final cassette tape, labeled simply, "For Tom." Thomas gently picked it up. After waiting more than 4 decades, Daniel still had one last story left to tell. 3 weeks later, the small church outside Asheville was filled beyond capacity. Veterans, neighbors, rangers from every generation, local families, and members of the Hayes family gathered together for a funeral that should have taken place 43 years earlier. For the first time, Sergeant Daniel Hayes was not being remembered beside an empty casket. He was finally coming home. Thomas Walker stood quietly beside James Hayes as the honor guard folded the American flag with slow, practiced precision. When the ceremony ended, the flag was placed into James's hands. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered, "I've waited my whole life for this." Thomas gently replied, "So did your father?" Following the funeral, Colonel Richard Evans formally announced the findings of the Army Records Review Board. The investigation concluded that Daniel Hayes had uncovered an unauthorized surveillance operation, protected the original evidence from being destroyed, and attempted to expose misconduct through lawful military channels. His disappearance had never been an act of desertion or failure. It had been the result of deliberate deception carried out by a handful of officials who feared the truth more than they respected an honorable soldier. Daniel's military record was completely restored. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for extraordinary integrity and courage under impossible circumstances. The officers responsible for altering the reports had long since passed away, but the Army publicly accepted responsibility for the injustice committed against Daniel and his family. None of that mattered as much to James as the letter his father had written before the mission. He carried it in his jacket pocket everywhere he went. Sometimes he simply unfolded it to read a few lines before carefully placing it back. It was the first time in 43 years he had ever heard his father's voice. A few days after the funeral, Thomas finally listened to the cassette labeled, "For Tom." The recording began with static before Daniel's familiar laughter filled the room. "If you're hearing this," Daniel said, "then you ignored every order to stay out of trouble and came looking for me anyway." Thomas smiled through tears. "You know me too well." Daniel continued speaking as though the years between them had never existed. He explained that after discovering the hidden surveillance program, he realized powerful people would do almost anything to bury the truth. Rather than allowing the evidence to disappear, he chose to hide it where only one person would ever think to search. "Thomas, you've always been too stubborn to quit." Daniel laughed softly on the tape. "That's why I knew someday you'd find me." The final minutes of the recording became quieter. "Dom, don't waste your life carrying guilt for mine. We both made the choices we believed were right. If I don't get another chance to say it, thank you for being my brother." The tape ended with several seconds of silence before clicking off. Thomas sat alone for a long time without moving. For the first time since 1983, he no longer wondered whether he could have saved Daniel. His friend had never blamed him. He never had. Months later, Black Pine Station officially became a protected historical site managed by the National Park Service and the Army together. The abandoned communications building was restored, not as a monument to Cold War secrets, but as a reminder that integrity sometimes demands extraordinary sacrifice. Inside the small museum, visitors could see Daniel's field journal, the restored communications equipment, photographs of the rangers who served there, and the weathered letter that had somehow spent 43 years trapped inside a forgotten mailbag before finally reaching its destination. Thomas donated Daniel's compass, the topographic map, and the old photograph that read "Brothers until the last patrol." They were displayed together beneath a simple bronze plaque. "Truth may be delayed, but it is never defeated." Every autumn, Thomas and James returned to Black Pine together. They walked the same trail to the old fire lookout, where everything had finally come to light. They never spoke much during those visits. They didn't need to. On one crisp October afternoon, Thomas placed his weathered Ranger beret on the stone where Daniel had once hidden the evidence. "Mission complete," he whispered. James smiled gently beside him. "He's finally home." Thomas looked across the endless Appalachian Mountains glowing beneath the autumn sun. 43 years earlier, he believed he had lost his best friend forever. Instead, he discovered that some promises simply take longer than others to keep, and sometimes the longest journey home begins with a letter that was never supposed to arrive, yet somehow finds exactly the person who never stopped waiting for it. Sometimes history is not written by those who were right. Sometimes it is written by those who were simply loud enough, powerful enough, or afraid enough to hide the truth. But history has one weakness. The truth is patient. It can wait inside a forgotten mailbag for 43 years, and when the time is finally right, it still finds its way home. Thomas Walker spent most of his life believing he had already said goodbye to his best friend. Like so many veterans, he carried invisible questions that never seemed to disappear. Could I have done more? Did I leave someone behind? Why did I survive when others did not? Those questions became part of his daily life until he almost forgot what living without them felt like. Then one unexpected letter changed everything. Daniel Hayes reminds us that courage is not always measured by what happens on a battlefield. Sometimes the greatest act of bravery is choosing honesty when dishonesty would be safer. He understood that protecting the truth might cost him his future. He understood that exposing wrongdoing could erase his own name from history. Yet he chose integrity anyway because he believed the country he served deserved nothing less. Many people never meet their heroes. James Hayes spent 43 years believing his father died before he ever knew him. In a single journey through the Appalachian Mountains, he discovered something far more valuable than military records or medals. He discovered the character of the man whose blood ran through his veins. He learned that his father had not disappeared because he failed. He disappeared because he refused to abandon what was right. That kind of inheritance can never be measured in documents. It lives inside the choices we make every day. Thomas also discovered that grief changes when truth finally arrives. For decades, he avoided memories because they hurt too much. He believed remembering Daniel meant reopening wounds that could never heal. Instead, he learned that the deepest healing often begins the moment we stop running from the past. The journey to Black Pine Station was never really about finding Daniel. It was about finding peace. There is another lesson hidden inside that old envelope. The letter was delayed by accident, but perhaps it arrived at exactly the right time. 43 years earlier, the world was not ready to hear Daniel's story. Too many secrets remained buried. Too many questions had no answers. Sometimes life asks us to wait much longer than we ever think possible before justice finally appears. Waiting does not mean hope has failed. Waiting sometimes means the story is still being written. Every one of us carries letters that were never sent, conversations that were never finished, promises we still wish we could keep, and people we continue missing long after everyone else believes we should have moved on. Perhaps the greatest gift we can offer those memories is not silence, but the courage to face them with open hearts, because love does not disappear when someone is gone, neither does truth. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever reconnected with someone after many years? Have you ever uncovered a family story that completely changed the way you understood your past? We'd be honored to read your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, forgotten heroes, hidden history, family, faith, hope, second chances, and the extraordinary journeys that begin with one unexpected letter. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every veteran still carrying silent memories. Comfort every family waiting for long overdue answers. Strengthen those who choose integrity even when no one is watching, and remind all of us that truth may sometimes travel slowly, but it never loses its way. And may you never forget that sometimes the most important letter of your life is not the one that arrives on time, but the one that arrives exactly when your heart is finally ready to open it.